So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 10:30 session this morning. This has been pre-recorded with Richard, and you'll be able to ask questions as he's presenting on this, because he'll be there live in person in the background, being able to answer your questions in the live discussion box. So welcome to this session. It's called Competency and the Building Safety Bill. Regulatory reform alongside industry culture change are both critical to ensuring that buildings are safe and the public are protected. Competency is a key enabler for those safe outcomes. And this session, which is going to be looking at how we join the dots of regulatory reform and industry proposals for competency management, a lot of which we'll be talking about over this two-day event. It will provide you with a clear understanding of the legal and ethical practices and drivers of the construction industry to seek and explain why competency is central, not peripheral, to demonstrating compliance in the future. So Richard is joining us. He's a technical director for CABE. Richard is a chartered building engineer and a chartered architect with experience in public and private practice. He worked for 10 years in central government on policy for building regulations, including head of technical policy. And he is currently technical director at CABE. So welcome, Richard, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to you to present.
Thank you very much, and it's very good to be here. I'm going to talk through what I think is some really fundamental principles about the way that competence and the proposals for regulatory reform for building regulations in the draft Building Safety Bill are going to interact. We've got a long history now, haven't we? We've come on a long journey since the tragic events at Grenfell Tower, and pretty much on an annual basis, we've got a kind of milestone document that's come out explaining how things are going to change. The Building a Safer Future final report in 2018, proposals for reform of the safety system in June 2019, a response to that, giving us more detail as to government's intentions in April 2020. And we can look forward to the draft building safety bill being laid relatively imminently. We had pre-consultation on that at the end of last year. It's a complex and substantial piece of legislation. It's important to understand that these reforms extend far beyond just high-risk buildings. This is not just about dealing with that higher end or more complex risk area. It really does include much more fundamental reform for everybody at all levels. And I think most importantly, it modifies the focus of building regulations away from what has historically been absolutely about the compliance of the building work, i.e. the fundamental physical manifestation of compliance that's achieved by the building, to reach into areas of competence, compliance, risk and process in a way that hasn't been the case over time. So in other words, competence is going to become one component of a much more complex matrix of measurables in terms of demonstrating compliance, and we really need to start to understand that. So what I'm going to do is run through the Building Safety Bill. I'm going to give a bit of an overview to the bill and also to the nature of the Building Safety Regulator, look at changes to the scope of regulations, look at the scope and sanctions and duties of the Building Safety Regulator will be able to impose and the duties that they have themselves, look at the new duty holding roles and requirements for competence, start to map these together, talk a little bit about regulation of building control inspectors, something about competence gateways and the safety case, and then talk generally about my perceptions as to how things might change. I do need to caveat things a little bit here. The Building Safety Bill is big, it's complex, but it doesn't contain all of the necessary detail to understand every aspect of how the new system will work. There's some very good explanatory notes. I'd recommend people have a look at those. But we do need to see secondary legislation in more detail in lots of areas. So I'm trying to fill some gaps in here, and things are subject to change as a result as those matters clarify. And of course, legislation itself can change as it goes through Parliament. So we're working on the documentation provided towards the end of last year that was subject to parliamentary scrutiny. to inform this. So things may change, but we'll obviously need to keep up with that and keep people informed as we go along. So how's the bill structured? What does it look like? Part one's a very brief introduction. Part two of the bill sets out the regulator and its functions, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail. Part three deals with the Building Act 1984. When I say that the measures in the bill go far beyond higher risk buildings, this is pretty much set out in the structure of the bill. There are amendments to the Building Act, and then there are specific provisions relating to just higher risk buildings. But it's really important that we get our heads around just how far-reaching the changes to the Building Act as a whole, and therefore the implications for the construction industry as a whole. Part four sets out measures to do with high-risk buildings, and part five, which we're not going to look at very much, has supplementary and general provisions relating to the New Homes Ombudsman, Construction Products Architects Regulation, and housing complaints. There are then a series of schedules to the bill covering various aspects in more detail, but we won't be looking at those too closely today. So let's talk about time as a first place. Where are we? Let's get a grip on how we're progressing on this. Well, the bill was submitted for pre-legislative scrutiny, I think in September last year, and the Select Committee, MHCLG Select Committee, published its response in November. We expect the new bill to be laid in front of Parliament in May. As far as I understand, sometime around the middle of May, probably after the Queen's speech, we will see the Building Safety Bill being laid in Parliament, and then it will go through the normal parliamentary process. The earliest point that it will get royal assent would be kind of October this year, but I think it's more likely to see it coming into force in probably March next year. So a Q1 coming into force date, commencement date for the legislation, maybe October 2022. Lots of legislation coming into force where there are transitional provisions. The government has suggested that some things will come into force immediately, so we'll need to keep a close eye on that. And the building safety regulator is due to be operative, we understand, sometime around March 2023. Now, there are two things to note within this. Firstly, that our understanding is that the Gateway 1 process is likely to be brought in sooner, much sooner. It's being delivered through the planning system. I'll talk very briefly about that as a heads up in a moment. But if we actually look at the time to prepare for this legislation coming into force in terms of the competence, upskilling, training that might be needed, the preparations, we're looking at a pretty short time period now. It's 18 months, but that's going to evaporate very, very quickly, I suspect. So I think there's a real sense of urgency and a genuine need to not wait for all the legislation to be in place. I know this is something Dame Judith Hackett has said repeatedly, but we are going to actually have to move forward on a principle-based basis in the coming months if we're going to actually be ready for when the new system comes into force. So I mentioned Gateway 1, which we think is going to be coming into place in summer this year at some stage, but certainly far, far sooner. The rationale for this is that it's being delivered through the planning system, so it's not dependent on the Building Safety Bill. It's going to enable consideration of fire safety at earlier points in the decision-making process. That will reduce the likelihood of planning being revised, the need to kind of amend planning applications to meet fire safety requirements. And it relates to higher risk buildings, the development site as a whole, and it happens before many of the duty holding requirements that we're going to talk about later are in place. It needs to be submitted with the planning application, and it will require a fire statement, which looks primarily at water supplies, emergency vehicle access, and fire information impacting on the planning process. And this is all going to happen relatively quickly. So I would just urge, just as a heads up, I would urge people to keep an eye out for details of Gateway 1 planning, which will be happening sooner than the other things we're going to talk about. Key to all of this is the implementation of transferring primary responsibility for building safety to the new building safety regulator, which we now know will be the HSE. Peter Baker has been confirmed as the first Chief Inspector of Buildings. He will be effectively the regulator for building standards and building safety in England for all types of building work. But the BSR will also act as the control authority for higher risk buildings. The bill's application mainly extends to England and Wales, and the majority of measures will only take force in England, although there are options for Wales to adopt them. But some measures will apply in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. Higher risk buildings in this context, just in case you aren't aware of the current definition, 2 or more dwellings, 2 or more rooms for residential purposes or student accommodation where the floor of the top story exceeds 18 metres or the building has more than 6 stories. And a room for residential purposes includes a wide range of purposes: residential care homes, residential institutions including prisons, temporary accommodation such as hotels, hostels, guest houses, etc. Also important to understand that building safety risk is defined within this, and that's limited to fire and structural safety and other factors that could affect fire and structural safety, so electrical safety and gas. That's quite wide-ranging in that respect. And at the moment, there's no intention to extend the higher risk building regime beyond fire and structural integrity, but that may change. That doesn't mean that the wider implications of the bill for building regulations are limited to just those factors. They are much more wide-ranging. The building safety regulator's objectives to secure safety of people in or about buildings and to improve the standard of buildings. So looking directly at risks associated with the building. So it's not about crime, it's about the building itself and the risks that it poses. But it also applies to the vicinity of your building. It's not just the actual immediate building itself. And the improvements that are looking at are to improve standards of performance or where required, improve compliance with existing standards. And those standards include building regulation requirements, guidance and approved documents, British and industry standards. And here we get to the key duties of the regulator. So we understand their overarching remit, and they have, I think, 5 key duties. Duty to facilitate safety in higher risk buildings. So to assist and encourage those responsible to secure safety. And it's a proactive duty. It's not just about enforcement. And this is something that's going to run through, I think, the entire life of the building safety regulator. It will have a much more active personality in informing and updating and providing information to assist responsible persons and duty holders in achieving the right outcomes. It's got a duty to keep safety and standard of buildings under review. So it's actually got to, again, actively keep on top of risk, review the adequacy of provisions. And again, that applies to all types and scale of building work. There's a duty to establish the system for giving of building safety information. So that includes the golden thread, mandatory safety reporting and whistleblowing. Proposals and consultation on regulations. It's got a duty to make recommendations to the government on what needs to change. But that's not just an arbitrary process. There are kind of stipulations as to how that happens. But most importantly, in the context of this talk, the building safety regulator has a duty to facilitate improvement in competence of industry and building inspectors. So again, provide assistance and encouragement to industry and building inspectors, including individuals and organisations, to improve their competence. It's going to establish a committee on industry competence. The exact remit of that committee is still to be defined, but it's basically an oversight function that will comment, review and advise as to what needs to be done to further drive improvements in industry competence. So a proactive, consistent, persistent process of review and interrogation. The BSR will undertake research, analysis, workshops and engagement to support understanding of competence and where competence needs to be improved. And very specifically, we'll look at competence of registered building inspectors, which is pulled out as a very specific area of competence to be managed, not least because the new Chief Inspector of Buildings will also be the head of the profession for the building control inspection world. Just trying to map out how some of these key features are relevant to high risk buildings or the building and construction world as a whole. These are kind of preliminary. Some of them need further detail to be absolutely sure about the extent of application, but we can see that the building safety regulator has got a remit that's limited to HRBs primarily when it's acting as a building control body, but otherwise as a regulator in setting guidance, overseeing the performance of building control bodies and professionals, and overseeing industry competence. It's going to be active across all types of building work. The duty holding responsibilities that are introduced as part of this bill in the large part relate to all building work. There are differentiations. There are higher levels of evidence required in relation to higher risk buildings. There are higher levels of sanction, but general duties, duties on clients, principal contractors, principal designers, designers and contractors. These are all going to apply in relation to all building work, whereas for the HRBs, we're looking at only the accountable person, building safety manager, and occupant duties being specific to HRBs. The gateway stages are all high risk buildings, and sanctions and enforcement are very mixed, but broadly, and I'll talk more about sanctions and enforcement, they are broadly applicable to all building work. There's only a couple of things that are simply limited to high risk buildings. There's going to be an introduction of a general duty, which is all duty holders have during design and construction work. And these are very reflective of CDM regulations, which play an important part in the development of this new legislation and the way that it's going to be implemented. But basically, the duties include cooperating and sharing information with others, including the building safety regulator, ensuring compliance with building regulations. So this is a clarification of, in many respects, of something that is already a case in law, but making it very specific and explicit that people have these requirements to comply with any specific requirements imposed by the new regime, and ensure that they and the people they appoint are competent. So this is fundamental. If you are a duty holder, and duty holders in this respect, as I'll explain in a moment, capture virtually everyone across the industry, you have to ensure that the people you appoint are competent and only undertake work within the limits of their competence. We'll talk about sanctions further because it's really important to understand how this competence, requirement to demonstrate competence, and the need to be able to demonstrate competence will play into the way that sanctions work. So who are the duty holding roles? Well, they're very familiar in the most part. The intention is for the CDM regulation duty holders to largely also assume duties in relation building safety. So the client, defined as any person for whom a construction project is carried out as part of their business. The principal designer, designer appointed by the client to control, plan, manage, coordinate, and monitor the pre-construction phase. Designers are any person who is on a trade, business, or other undertaking in connection with which they prepare or modify a design, or arrange for or instruct any person under their control to prepare or modify a design. Principal contractor, very CDM, absolutely the same definitions. The contractor appointed by the client to plan, manage, or coordinate construction phase. Contractor, any person who manages or controls construction work, or employs or engages construction work as a contractor. New names, new duties. The accountable person is the duty holder during a building's occupation. So there has to be a named accountable person. They are the legal duty holder in occupation, but they have to appoint a building safety manager to oversee the safety and oversee and maintain the safety of the building and undertake a whole range of activities, including engagement with residents. It's very important to remember, though, the building safety manager is not a duty holder. The duty holder is the accountable person. Looking at those roles in more detail, the key things that we need to draw from this are a focus on compliance and then a link through to demonstrating competence where there's a failure of compliance. For principal designers and designers, there's a strong focus on ensuring compliance with the building regulations. That includes procedural requirements such as information through the golden thread. And ultimately, the principal designer will have to sign a declaration that, to the best of their knowledge, the building complies with the building regulations. And again, that's both technical and procedural requirements. So there is a because competence assurance is part of the procedural process for higher risk buildings, but buildings in general will also need to have those requirements. It is important that competence is seen as part of that declaration. Construction, again, similar to CDM regulations, but again, a focus on planning and management of the process to ensure that the building complies with the building regulations, duties to communicate. They must not work unless they're satisfied the client is effectively aware of their duties. But again, they're also going to have to sign a declaration that the building complies with the building regulations to the best of their knowledge. In terms of duty holding roles for the client and occupation, again, similar emphasis: deliver compliance with the building regulations, put in place measures to ensure that those they appoint comply with their responsibilities in relation to building safety. So that includes measurement of competence and assurance of competence of those that they appoint, and putting in place an accountable person who will take on that role. They are the duty holder, primarily for occupation, including appointing the building safety manager and ensuring the building safety manager's competence. And the building safety manager has to ensure the competence of persons employed to manage and maintain their building. A brief word about the kind of regulation of building control professionals. I won't dwell on this too much, but they've been identified specifically as a group that requires full registration to be competent. As I said, the new Chief Inspector of Buildings will be the first head of profession for building control professionals. There will be kind of increased regulation through the BS, Building Safety Regulator of building control bodies. So we're going to see over time a process for statutory registration of building control professionals, building control approvers, which is what approved inspectors will be referred to as in the future. And there'll be a legal requirement for clients to take advice from a registered building inspector. So only a registered building inspector can provide advice, and it must be consulted. There's proposals for reinstating a professional structure around building control, but those are still in very early stages. And if people are more interested in how that might work, there was a report produced by a group of sector leaders from building control on the recommendations on future regulation of building control sector and profession in England, that was published in I think July last year, and that contains a lot of background and information and some ideas about how that model might work, although these are industry-led proposals, not government endorsed proposals. Very quickly, there are questions that remain about how this particular aspect will work. So who's going to regulate? Will it be the building safety regulator or a delegated body regulating building control? How will registration be managed? What standards will be expected? How will the transition be managed? And what requirements will be introduced for organisational competence and oversight? Those issues remain outstanding, but I think it's really important to recognise that the emphasis placed on the competence of the building control sector is a real mirror to the importance of competence in general within the overall framework. These are pretty much unprecedented steps that are being taken in terms of regulating function of key actors within the construction sector, and we should really take note of that. And we should certainly take note of the sanctions that are being brought in. These are really quite extensive, and I'm going to try and summarize these, but the key understanding is that the fundamental powers within the Building Act are being significantly extended. So section 35 and 36, which is powers to act in the case of a breach of building regulations or whether the notice requiring rectification, though the time periods for enforcement and action in these cases are being extended from 1 or 2 years to 10 years, and they carry unlimited fines on conviction and fines of up to 200 per day until default's corrected. So the time period over which non-compliance can be enforced against or prosecuted for is extending hugely. And that's important because non-compliances will emerge far more frequently within that 10-year timescale than they do within a 1 or 2 year timescale. There are a whole series of new offences around providing false or misleading evidence to the building safety regulator, impersonating a building control inspector, contravention giving rise to risk of death and serious injury, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Compliance notices and stop notices, liabilities of officers of body corporate, building inspector providing advice outside scope of registration, obstructing or impersonating officers of the building safety regulator, failure to provide information to the building safety regulator, and failure to register an in-scope building. But I want to come back to two in particular. So firstly, the sanction for contravention giving rise to risk of death and serious injury. It applies to building safety risks in higher risk buildings and their immediate environment, but it doesn't require something to go wrong. It just requires for a risk not to be managed properly. That's an unlimited fine and up to 2 years in prison. Where a prosecution is successful in determining that an organisation has failed in managing its responsibilities or complying with the requirements of legislation, liability of officers of body corporate is something that's going to put everyone within that organisation and that decision-making chain at risk of further prosecution. So any director, manager, secretary or other officer of an organisation can be prosecuted if they consent, connive or are negligent effectively. So we need to understand these sanctions, and these sanctions all have links back to competence. So we're going to see a new system for competence emerging. People will be familiar with this to some degrees. This is a fairly crude representation, but we're looking at the building safety regulator having this oversight committee on competence. There'll be an MHCLG approved document on competence. So that is statutory guidance on how to demonstrate and meet competence requirements. We look forward to seeing that. That will help a great deal. BSI have produced Flex 8670, which is a framework for building safety competence. I'll talk about that in a moment. The industry has its own competence steering group, and that should help the development of a whole series of sector-specific competence frameworks, which will be managed by professional bodies, certification and training bodies, trade bodies and associations. Those will all need to be subject to third-party oversight or accreditation of some form. This is Dame Judith Hackett's point about marking of own homework and ensuring that there is some scrutiny to maintain standards. And we're going to see a system that relies on much more granular validation of competence at different levels and for different types of work, and over time revalidation as well. Brief word about Flex 8670 if you haven't looked at it. This is the standard for competence frameworks for building safety that's been produced and sets out core criteria for those frameworks. It's effectively setting measurement and benchmarking tools to drive frameworks to ensure that the core behavioural and technical, if you like, competencies to achieve building safety are properly accounted for in all construction frameworks, but particularly those relating to HRBs. And that kind of brings us to kind of a point where we need to kind of look at this in the round and say, what does this actually mean for competence as a whole? There are a whole series of drivers that are coming through the market in terms of competence, as well as the building safety. So we've got the new duty holding roles. We know that there are huge issues in the insurance markets, and demonstrating competence has got a part to play in helping to address those issues. Clients are seeking greater assurance and will need to do so to meet their legal obligations. There are a whole series of regulated roles and restricted functions coming through. There are more severe sanctions and enforcement mechanisms, but there are also kind of really important and powerful drivers just to do the right thing. We must actually be more professional, be more responsible, and make sure that people are protected. We're going to see, I think, a stronger competence management marketplace, which involves a kind of a ratcheting up of the test required for CPD, much more focus on personal development planning and doing that in a methodical way. More specialization, so more detail on the specific limits of people's competence and how that's tested. We're going to see revalidation come in, so periodically, maybe every 2, 3, 4, 5 years, depending on what you do, which is going to be a real change for the sector, but one that's really beneficial. And we're going to see much more in terms of registration, much more requirement to use third-party assessment and independent registration process. Facilitators for this, we're going to see specialist grade certification, as I say, enhance the more specialized CPD, and a big towards increased micro learning with tests. There are benefits to this. We're going to have safer buildings, more competent professionals, more competent industry overall. That should give us higher productivity, better working environment, improved insurability. There are big opportunities for employers and employees to improve skills, deliver much better recognition for training and development, and there will be new spaces where particular skill sets are recognised as their opportunities. But there are also challenges in this. There's uncertainty around statutory requirements in the short term. Shifting culture on training and competence management is always going to be hard. We need to really rethink the way that we look at investing in these. And there's time and commitment needed to address this. In terms of risks, we need to understand that there's a massive increase in the risk of sanction, complex new regulatory environments that we need to navigate, and we need to take the steps necessary to address the problems in insurance. So I think overall, we're going to see a much more blended approach to compliance in the activities of the building safety regulator. They're going to sanction more, they're going to intervene more, but they're also going to expect the industry as a whole doesn't just seek to kind of achieve a technically compliant solution, but also actively records and manages the way that risk is being dealt with in a way to actually protect people. So we'll see a kind of, I think, a mid-ground between the risk-based process that is applied to health and safety and the compliance-based process that has been the primary mechanism of building regulations over time. But what we need to think about in real clarity is also about how we change the environment we work in to facilitate those kind of procedural changes. So we need leadership at the top of organizations to speak about ethical values and live by them. We need to set a strong, to establish a strong safety culture. We need to align our systems and procedures and behaviors to promote challenge, disclosure and mitigation of risk. We need to improve communication and training, and we need to provide that training where needed and refresh it as necessary. We also need to focus on re-establishing technical competence. We need a strong competence management culture. CPD and lifelong learning will need to be increasingly more formal and accredited. And we need to rebalance the technical versus commercial imperatives in the sector. And finally, I think we need to just adjust to having a much more proactive regulator. I'm not talking about actual kind of ground level regulator, but the regulator in setting direction for the sector as a whole. And we need to recognise that in many respects, the incentives in this space aren't divided. Focusing on how we protect people and deliver compliance in the buildings that we construct doesn't just deliver the right societal outcomes, but it's also going to be vital in ensuring businesses are able to demonstrate they've acted responsibly. Lastly, I think I would just emphasise from the timeline that we had at the beginning that it's important to actually move on this now. We can't wait to see all the detail of the legislation. We generally know what's going to be right. We generally understand what is expected, and I think we have to move ahead of the regulatory curve to ensure that we're able to deliver that at the earliest possible point. So thank you very much. I hope that's been useful, and I will have been answering questions during this and will be available for, I think, for a short period after.
Thank you very much, Richard. And yeah, as Richard said, if you want to ask questions for Richard, he'll be online for another 10-15 minutes in the live discussion. So thank you very much. That was very informative, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.